on the vertical is how can a singular brand sound the same over those different horizontal touch points. So if you have, this kind of simulated banking experience, for example, how does it sound similar when you visit an ATM versus banking on your phone?
Hmm.
And how does voice banking or conversational banking is a better word for it. How does it sound when you do banking over a voice experience like Alexa?
Hmm.
And so where are the similarities between them, and then where are the distinctions? So instead of just using the same exact power on sound, how does it differ based on the speaker quality of the product you're hearing it on,
Yeah, it's a good
or
question.
just the context of what you're using it in, right?
Welcome to Audio Branding, the hidden gem of marketing. I'm your host, Jody Krangle, and this podcast will discuss just how sound influences our behavior. I generally talk about this in the context of advertising and marketing, but there are other places this is important too. I really feel that it plays a much more important role in our lives than maybe we realize. So let's delve a little deeper. This is the second part of my interview with Eric Seay. So how do you go about building an audio brand for a company that maybe isn't Pantone? I
Yeah.
mean, that gave you a
So
very specific criteria, right? You were making a sound for a color. But if
mhm.
there's a brand name or like a particular company that has a feel, I guess, do you have like a process that you go through in order to build up something for them?
Absolutely. And the way that comes together in terms of a chronological order is similar to other agencies, in which you undergo an immersion phase, a research phase, a workshop phase to some degree, and then creation.
Hmm.
For us, what that comes down to is the research phase is really a way for us to open up the brand's ears to what their competitors are doing. So it's much deeper than, oh, this other brand is using rock music, don't use rock music. It's a lot deeper than that.
Hmm.
In which case we're able to have them almost learn more about themselves by listening. And
Yeah,
so
I'm curious about that too, because I wonder how many clients actually have thought about this and how many you have to sort of educate from the bottom up.
yeah, it's a mix. I think more and more brands now are thinking about it.
Hmm.
Earlier on, sometimes it takes a little bit of convincing in a way, but I think now that everyone's talking about it, so with you and your podcast out there, and
Hmm.
people writing articles, it's more top of mind for everyone. So
Hmm.
luckily more brands are thinking about it now than they used to. But sometimes, and almost in any case, there's some kind of onboarding to be able to cross that bridge and break down those barriers of communication between esoteric music terms and scientific terms, and then just the pure artistic expression of sound. And
Hmm.
so that's what our process aims to do, is really triangulating a white space for that brand based on key stakeholder interviews and our research data, and how we analyze the competitors, and how immersive we go in that audit, and then how we're able to deduce really meaningful insights out of it before we ever even write a single note.
Hmm.
And that's what makes it so much different than just getting a brief and writing that brief remotely. For us, a brief is almost like an entire microsite that eventually becomes the whole design system. So it's really much more than just a couple prompts.
Yeah,
It's,
wow.
linked to databases and links to everything.
Now, you don't always make an ear con or like a sonic brand for these companies. It doesn't necessarily have to involve that kind of thing.
Right.
Or is it just like a general sound design kind of deal?
Um, yeah, true on all ends. It's not always one or the other. It's not always just an ear con or UX sound. It's
Hmm.
not always just an audio logo. Part of that process is actually drumming up what the most influential thing that brand can do is. So in that case of Pantone, that was more long form music as opposed to what we traditionally do more of, which would be an audio logo or a suite of interrelated user experience sounds or user
Mm-hmm.
interface sounds. And so during that process, we can make recommendations of where sound should go, and if there are UX sounds, what interactions they should associate with. And so i- to be able to do that, we need to understand the technologies that the brands are using. And so part of my job as chief experience officer is to push those experiences to their limits, to be able to understand what's possible, what's realistic, and what are really cool moments that we can work with. And so that's why I spend sometimes more time writing music than I used to, and more time prototyping skills on Alexa or prototyping experiences in XD or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. And how does psychoacoustics come into this? Because I know there's, when you're crafting a sound for a company, I guess you want people to be able to experience it in a real emotional way. And the best way to get them to do that is to approach it from almost a psychological point of view.
Definitely. It's a multi-layered approach because
Mm-hmm.
every aspect you design, especially in such a small sound, is so important. And I'd say we put as much thought into these little sounds as companies probably used to put into an audio logo. Part of how we, I guess, practice the psychoacoustics is through research and user testing, and to validate our assumptions, which we use to compose. And so, one of the one of the most exciting things we did in that regard was we worked with the audio efficacy platform Veritonic to create the first real white paper that evaluated the efficacy of a branded earcon, and
Mm-hmm.
how how did that affect purchase intent, and so all the ROI and KPI type factors, as well as just what does it mean for cognitive load in terms of associating this type of sound with this type of interaction. And so from there you can start to triangulate what are kind of the best practices for sounds. For instance, does a an upward melody really indicate something turning on versus a downward reciprocal motion mean powering off?
Mm-hmm.
And again, is that a universal thing? Is that a melody construct of Western harmony, or is something of acceleration and pitch more universal, like when you fire up an engine on a car, as the RPM increases, you could say that's a parallel of you know an increase of hertz, and so that would
Mm-hmm.
be an upward motion as something starts. And so are those types of just arcs really, or what we call just a gesture in a way, is the kind of melodic arc, is that maybe more universal than the melody part itself, and as opposed to going a major third up means it's
Mm-hmm.
positive, right? So
Yeah,
we
it's
definitely,
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, we put as much thought as possible into literally every every little step of this process. And so yeah, 100% the psychoacoustics is down to the very atom of each sound we do.
So in that paper that you did, what were some of the conclusions that you came to? How did it change people's experience or make them do things they didn't think of doing before?
Well, one of the, I think an important thing we gleaned was that, and just to give a general sense of what the differences were, the we had a generic set and a premium set. And so the generic set was more of what you'd hear with like a piezo beep. In our case, we even gave it slightly better quality. So it was more of just a generic kind of blippy sine wave.
Okay.
Whereas the premium set was more layered and had more dimensions to it in terms of reverb, layers, delay,
Mm-hmm.
things like that. And so even just between that basic generic sound and the premium sound, I found that twice as many people were willing to blindly purchase the smart speaker that had just a cooler startup sound.
Oh.
So, it can be that simple where just if you hear one sound versus another, if you have a premium smart speaker, it should have premium sounds, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
that was one thing we're able to learn, as well as people being able to associate the interactions better. So more people were able to guess that the premium power on sound was the speaker powering up as opposed to the generic power on sound, meaning that, versus maybe meaning it was connecting to a Bluetooth device. Without layering it, you're pretty much reduced to melody almost.
Mm-hmm.
And with just a singular instrument, it's harder to differentiate between families of interactions.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the better sounds made for a better experience.
Exactly. Which could have been an alt title. It's called Small Sounds Mean Big Business. So I like that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It definitely rings true.
Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
So you have you were talking about UX, the user first mentality. Can you expand a little on that? Because I know that, that's a big thing now, obviously, but especially for audio branding, because I guess you kind of need to hold people's hands through this.
Definitely. It's a multi-layered term when we say audio UX for sure, because it does mean UX in the traditional sense of user experience and what UX designers do and how sound can augment, their different interactions that they're developing. It also, like you mentioned, has to do with the user first mentality that we focus on. So it came from working with so many different UX teams on a lot of the work we started off doing, which was notification sounds and ringtones and how does a whole family of sounds fit together as opposed to just making a one-off. And that's really one of the biggest challenges is how do you make sure that everything sounds the same without being redundant, and how do you design that whole system? And so in that sense, the user experience side is literal. And then on the more metaphorical side, the user experience is, like I mentioned before, how does a user experience sound within the context of that brand, and how beyond audio X, just audio user experience really being the new way to think about audio branding. And so what it comes down to is, on the one hand, working more closely with the real UX designers working on the product as opposed to just, handing over an audio logo and hoping things go well.
Yeah.
It's a lot more hands-on and even where we get in there and do a lot of prototyping, even with these different teams, and even in platforms like Adobe XD, which I can actually talk a little more about in a minute. But
please do.
Yeah. But on that side of things, we validate with user testing, just like UX designers do, and these sounds are ultimately highlighting those moments that they work on in those different user flows and story flows. And so that's really the cross section of the name of audio UX. It's both really the spirit of what we call the future of audio branding, as well as lifting that preconceived notion of audio branding as just an audio logo, how it's really more about the experience, which as some of the projects I'm mentioning hopefully illuminate, is that sometimes it's more of sound and Alexa skill than just an audio logo, or sometimes it's a fully immersive, interactive audio experience at a physical location.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And certainly having a company that has the psychology know-how to get the best reaction from the people who are listening is an important aspect of that. for ways to improve your company's or podcast's impact? You'd be surprised how powerful the use of an intentional audio branding strategy can be. Want to know more? I have a free downloadable PDF that gives you my 5 tips for implementing an intentional audio strategy at voiceoversandvocals.com/audio-branding-strategy. That location does ask to put you on a mailing list, just to send you updates on when the new podcasts come out. But if you really don't want to give your email out, I understand. Just contact me directly. My email is all over my website, and I'll make sure you get that PDF without needing to sign up anywhere. If you do sign up, though, you also get access to a resources section called The Studio, where I have videos, white papers, and PDFs, discounts from my guests, and snippets of audio from my guests that no one else gets to hear. So maybe it's worth your while. Totally up to you. And of course, if you're looking for voiceovers, you can get in touch with me about that too. Now, back to the podcast. I'd love to hear more about Adobe. I don't know what you're doing with them, but that would probably be fascinating to hear about.
Yes. So one of the more recent exciting announcements as of now is that Adobe XD now supports audio playback, which it didn't used to. And so a lot of developers use XD for prototyping mobile application flows or website flows. And even when the SaySpring team joined Adobe, as they brought in more voice platforming. And so XD really allowed, in a way, a brand to try out all those different mediums that, for us, sound eventually goes to. And so now that sound is involved, we're working with Adobe to create almost a best practice walkthrough of where experienced designers and UX designers can put sounds in their experiences. And it's being developed as an interactive piece. And so by the time this airs, that should be out, which will be very exciting.
Yeah, that does sound very exciting.
And it'll come out shortly. And so it also gives us an opportunity now where with Pantone, the unique avenue is that we were really doing a sonic branding process on a color. Now, in this case with Adobe XD, we're developing an audio design system for a software, again, as opposed to a brand, because it's not about, in this particular instance, this isn't us audio branding Adobe. This is us showing the best ways to implement sound, which is the UX side of things. Obviously, it's not just what is the sound, it's where does it go and how can it be optimized. And so we really break down everything from the different archetypes of a UX sound, whether it fits into more of an audio haptic or simulated haptic, whatever preferred term you have there, just basic acoustical feedback that something as simple as a button has been pressed. And so in the absence of a physical or mechanical haptic, a sound that gives you an indication that this function that would otherwise make a real sound, like pressing a real button, comes into play. And so again, that ties in a lot of the skeuomorphic sound design principles I mentioned earlier. So those come back into play, where when you tap something, you probably expect to hear something reminiscent of something you've tapped on before. And so we go into the core categories of sound functionalities. And so beyond that baseline haptic, what are the core principles of a notification versus a more celebratory success moment? And then how can those be pieced together in more of a horizontal format of walking through a setup flow? And so in this case, for say like an IoT type experience, if you're setting up, imagine like a Google Nest type home security or camera or something, how does that flow together where you have an app and you have a product and they're both making sounds together? What are the moments you should highlight? How should they progress in harmony? And where should it be celebratory or where should it be subtle? And then on top of that, then more on the vertical is, how can a singular brand sound the same over those different horizontal touch points? So if you have, this kind of simulated banking experience, for example, how does it sound similar when you visit an ATM versus banking on your phone,
Mm-hmm.
and how does voice banking or conversational banking is a better word for it. How does it sound when you do banking over a voice experience like Alexa?
Mm-hmm.
And so where are the similarities between them, and then where are the distinctions? So instead of just using the same exact power on sound, how does it differ based on the speaker quality of the product you're hearing it on,
Yeah, it's a good
or
question.
just the context of what you're using it in, right?
A
And
lot of things
which,
to think about.
oh yeah, and I guess I'll actually just parlay from that point there to the final stage of our process, which
Hmm.
is what we call optimizations or tuning, device specific tuning. And that's really the final check mark of making sure that, again, this is kind of where the Venn diagram overlaps between just handing off a sound and making sure it gets where it needs to go. So not only to make sure the brand knows what to do with it, and that it gets to where it needs to be, but that when it gets there, it sounds like it should. Obviously,
Yeah.
with the burgeoning world of different speakers that have Alexa or don't have Alexa, or different size smartphones, tablets, anything. And like I said, even ATMs or any kind of kiosk or point of sale, anything, to make sure that by the time the sound gets to that device, that it's encoded the right way
Hmm.
and that it sounds as good as it should. So for us, that means mixing it on the device itself, and we we designed from that from the beginning, by the way, too, because I don't want
Hmm.
you to think that we get all the way there and realize, oh no, this will never sound good on a smart speaker, right? So
Well, no, you don't want to
that's
get through the whole process and then not be able to use it on what they want it on. I mean,
right. So
yeah.
I should say that now. So obviously early on in that, like I mentioned, the immersion phase is when we
Hmm.
get product specifications and things like that. So we can really design for the experience we're designing for. And so then when we get to that point, to be able to optimize it, to tweak it, to make sure everything's perfect, as much as we can, we work on the device or a prototype of the device, or a, as close of an analog as we can get. Maybe it's a hardwired version, maybe
Hmm.
it's a simulated workflow on a digital audio workstation, or a plugin. But that's it's actually a time when my voice prototyping skills have come in handy. And so for an IoT project, we just finished a similar kind of home um, thermostat security. The whole ecosystem
Okay.
came in handy, where part of the team went on site to do optimizations, and now because these were Alexa enabled, I was able to then basically create an Alexa skill where they could just play the sounds on the device remotely. And so we were able to have this, again, talk about working remotely, in this case
Hmm.
being a country apart, and me just being able to refresh and have them conversationally just ask the device to play the sounds they want to hear, and instead of having to break the thing open and hardwire it, which we also do have to do sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. So yeah, that's a pretty immersive process there.
Yes. And so my early days of soldering and fixing cables at those
Comes in
old
handy.
studios I used to enter, yeah, internet, have really come in handy now.
I'm sure. There's one question I want to ask you, especially now. I'm curious, has the sound types that you're seeing now in the age of COVID-19, have they kind of changed since before that happened? Are you seeing any change in the actual sounds people want to hear?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't seen enough data to suggest one thing or another.
I guess it's
Do you
only been a few
mean
months, but yeah, I'm just curious. I know voiceover has
right?
changed quite a lot.
Yeah. Do you mean more like, do people expect to hear more positive sounds to counteract
Not
things, or maybe
necessarily. I'm wondering if people are wanting comfort a lot more than they
right?
did before.
I think that's definitely true, and even if it's not manifested in the smaller sounds, I think it
Hmm.
is manifested in the longer form sounds, and a more of a demand for things like sleep sounds.
Yes.
And so
Meditation, things that'll
exactly.
soothe you. Yeah.
One of the other voice experiences that we've worked on. So again, we'll work on more traditional brands as well as voice specific brands. One of the more voice specific ones, Invoked Apps, is one of the biggest ambient sound apps on Alexa.
Mm-hmm.
And so for them, well, the unique challenge there was each sound type has its own unique skill. And so when you have this umbrella of, at the time, 52 different apps, how do you tie them together and let people know that it's Invoked Apps by Nick Schwab and not, Sleepy Sounds by whomever else?
Yeah,
right?
that's
And
a
so
lot.
we were able to create an onboarding sound that tied all those together. And, now I can only imagine what the numbers are now, but hundreds of thousands of people were streaming those per day, and
I'll
maybe
bet
it
it's
was
gotten larger.
million. Yeah. And so we're working on some other unreleased type sleeping sounds now as well,
Mm-hmm.
for a different brand, and more for less for meditation and more almost for just deep sleep stuff.
Okay. Okay.
So I think that definitely the need for that kind of sound comfort, and even the funny thing I mentioned earlier of the office sounds, honestly, I
Yeah.
think there's definitely a higher demand for comfort noise right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just curious because I am I'm pretty sure that everything around us that we're experiencing psychologically for any other reason affects everything we want in general. So our sensory experiences affect what other sensory experiences we want.
Oh, it's
Yeah.
definitely true. And I'm even surprised sometimes how powerful it is. And I'll prototype audio AR experiences where I put together an old project we had done, and it was an interactive experience where I took all the stems from the physical location and created an ambisonic soundscape out of it. And so even here working from home, as I'm looking around the room and hearing the sound shift around me, really feel like I'm somewhere else. And so it is a powerful thing where
Mm-hmm.
the more that audio AR becomes accessible on more products, I think the more people can make these audioscapes to the beach or the forest.
Sure.
It's a really, really powerful effect.
Yeah, very true. So what else can you talk about that you're actually doing like right now? Have you already said everything that you're working on at the moment, or is there more
True,
stuff
it's
coming up?
that's always the catch in audio branding is, what are you working on? And the answer is typically I can't really say,
Yeah.
which is still true. But of some of the ones I mentioned, I can give a little more specific on the IoT company I was talking about.
Mhm.
Is actually Ecobee.
Okay.
And so Ecobee is a home IoT company based in Canada, actually, that is one of the featured product lines that has Alexa capabilities on board.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the cross-discipline of kind of designing for an Alexa type experience and designing for a product setup workflow came to be. So our ability to already understand the Alexa ecosystem, everything from what key signature Alexa's sounds are versus something like Ecobee, or as deep as you want to get to understanding and how we can cross reference how the sounds are going to come out and how they're going to sound, was critical to the process. And so those are out now, as well as the new branding. And so we'll have hopefully have a case study up on that soon that you'll be able to see. One exciting thing I'll actually mention about Ecobee, which is maybe sounds like a counterintuitive point or something like that, but one of my favorite things they did actually doesn't have our music in it, and I'll explain why.
Okay.
It's because they used our audio design system to create it. And so someone created a piece of music that works with all our sounds and then seamlessly blends into the audio logo we made for them.
Wow.
And so I think it's a use case in empowering brands to have an ownable audio identity.
Yeah,
And
do their
so
own thing.
exactly.
That's really
You don't
good.
necessarily need to write everything for every brand. And as much as, the quality control can be guaranteed if you do, but if you have a team as brilliant as Ecobee, then they can do that as well.
Mm-hmm. That's fantastic. I like the idea
Yeah.
that they can just sort of take it and run with it. That's fantastic.
Right. Because you almost don't want it to be the opposite, because if it's all or nothing, and if you only write one brand theme and they either use it or they use stock music, then
Mm-hmm.
it almost doesn't work for you anymore, because it's hit or miss.
Well, it has to be
Um,
evolving or it doesn't
Exactly.
last very long. I mean, things change pretty
Exactly.
quickly.
And that's really what's important, is making sure that there's consistency over time, so that's what the evolution's all about, so that it's not just, oh, we drop this one track and it'll expire
Yeah.
eventually.
Yeah. Not great.
Yeah.
So people
So
will.
I just
Okay.
like to talk about that point, because
Yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate it. And I love that idea. I think it's great that the companies themselves can get so involved in it, because it really should be a part of their whole identity. And
Yeah,
they should know what that identity is, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So your website has a lot of these case studies that you've done in the past. I know you have something on Pantone there, definitely.
Yes, and we're actually in the process of putting some new ones up. So definitely, when you hear this, check out auxnyc.com or audiox.com. They forward to the same place,
Mhm.
and you can see all the latest and greatest that we're putting out.
That'll be great. And is there a way that people can find you on social media? Are you guys on any particular place?
Sure, we're active a little bit everywhere. I think the website's the best, but we're AUX_NYC on most social platforms. So Twitter and Instagram, you can find us that way.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today. This was really fascinating.
Definitely fantastic. Yeah, I'm happy you had me on, Jody. Thank you.
Mhm. Thanks. Well, that's the end of this episode. Thanks for listening. And if you like what you heard, why not tell a friend about this podcast? It's available on all the usual outlets. Until next time.